Okay, Rabbi Sai, we're about to start Perek Yud Daled. Perek Yud Daled. Someone asked me to address a certain issue regarding what we're learning now. And that's the issue of the. There doesn't seem to be a tremendous amount of practical significance in terms of avoida, connected with what we're doing now. You should just know that Ayin Beis is regarded as the sefer of Haskalah of Hasidus, of certainly the Hasidus, the Rebbe Rashab. There's plenty of sefer Haskalah of the Mittler Rebbe also, but the avoida component, certainly in the first part of the sefer, until we get to, let me see which mimer it is. Until we get to later Maimorim anyway, is kind of, yeah, to a certain extent in the 13th mimer, really gets a little bit more avoidic. But the point is, I would like to answer and give a teretz to this, according to something that I learned in from a mimer and a sicha from the Rebbe. It's a sicha at the end of Chelik Parshas Kiseitze, the end of the Sicha in Chelik Yudalad, and then there's a mimer in Tavshin Chof Hey Kiseitze, in Divrei Maschel Kiseitze. And the both the mimer and the Sicha address the question of the beginning of the parsha. It says Kiseitze le'melchama alo yivecha. And all throughout Chassidus, from the Baal Shem Tov through the Alter Rebbe and so on and so forth, all right throughout and to the Rebbe's Maimorim, they always explain this as the inner milchama against the person's Yetzer Hara, against his Nefesh Bahamis, and so on and so forth. And that's what the milchama is all about. The problem is, how does this fit with the inyan of what Rashi says, that this is a melchemes harishus. L'chayra, the melchema with your Yetzer Hara is a melchemes choiva. It's a melchemes mitzvah. It's not a melchemes rishus. So the Rebbe has a very interesting explanation, and the explanation is as follows. He says that there are two drochim, there are two ways, two approaches to become davuk to elokus. Basically, that's the idea, to become davuk to elokus. One way is the way of milchama, which is the way of tefillah and milamata lamayla, and that demands a tremendous amount of self-refinement and self-elevation and so on and so forth to get to cleave to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through tefillah. There's another way, and that's the way of Torah, which is b'derech menucha, b'derech shalom, not b'derech milchama. And that's the clarification of certain inyonim in Torah. It's not a milchama in the same kind of way. You're not fighting with yourself, but you're just struggling to clarify an issue, clarify an idea. And I would say that the Maimorim, certainly in the beginning of Ayin Beis, for the first, at least the first 10, 12, 13 Maimorim, are much more of the Haskalah type. We don't get to wait until much later. And the inyan of the Haskalah is not that it's just Stam Haskalah, but it's Birur and Dveikus in the oifen of Shalom, and the oifen of Menucha. And that's why it's called Rishus, because you could choose either way. In the beginning, everyone has to choose the way of Tefillah, because that's an obligation. But later on, it's possible to go, not that someone who learns Torah doesn't daven, but the Iker battle, so to speak, that he wages is not through Tefillah, but rather through clarifying inyonim in Halacha and clarifying inyonim in Torah in general. And I would say clarifying inyonim in Chassidus, which is really what Ayin Beis does. It brings down inyonim which are very often not very clear in other sources. So the Rebbe Rashab clarifies a tremendous amount of inyonim in Ayin Beis that just bring it into tremendous focus and clarity and so on. Okay, that is my take on the situation of why there's not so much avoider in these Maimorim. It's a different kind of avoider. Okay. We have been discussing all along the concept of there is a tziur in the ohros as well as in the kalim. This is the thesis that the Rebbe Rashab is presenting us with, that it's not that the ohros of bechinas pshitus, like the Ramak explained, from the moshel of water in different colored glasses, but rather, different color cups, but rather that the oil itself has a certain tziur, and that's why this particular oil is shaykh to this particular kli. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this particular oil is shaykh only to that particular kli, because there's different madregas in the oil, and therefore this oil could go into another kli as well. It's the oil of chesed, but it can be in the kli of gvura, or it's the oil of gvura, but it can be in the kli of chesed. It's very hard to explain the inyan of achlifu duchtayu, that they change their places, because since it's an or which is or pashut, it's not an or of chesed and a kli of gvura, an or of gvura and a kli of chesed. It's simply or pashut. So according to the Ramak, it's very difficult to explain this fundamental concept in the Zohar, which is taught in a number of different places in the Zohar. There was another possibility that he addressed, that maybe we're not talking about gvul mamash in the kalim of Atzilus, but according to the way he explained it in previous chapters, that we can't argue that over here, because since we're talking about Olam Atzilus, in Atzilus there is mamash the kalim amugbalim, even though they're only they bechinas ein sof, that's only in the world of Atzilus, but they're not mugbal outside of they are mugbal outside of the world of Atzilus. And it's not just koyach hagvul that the kalim of Atzilus are all about, because that only applies in the Or Ein Sof, the koyach hagvul in the Or Ein Sof before the tzimtzum. Okay, we discussed that all at length in previous shiurim, just to get you back to where we are. And he went on to say that, therefore, there must be a tziur in the oil. And now he begins to explain it a little bit more. V'yuvan zeh l'mayla al derech ma'amar Chazal shtok kach ala b'machshova. He's going to explain this by way of ma'amar Chazal, silence, this is the way it rose in thought. Now, what's it talking about? What's the incident? This is a Gemara in Menachos. Menachos Daf Chof Tes Amud Beis, I believe, where the Gemara is talking about the death of Rabbi Akiva. Moshe Rabbeinu is having this whole discourse with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he shows HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe Rabbeinu Rabbi Akiva. And Moshe Rabbeinu hears Rabbi Akiva talking, and he can't even understand what he's talking about. It's much too advanced for him, for Moshe Rabbeinu. He couldn't understand it. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so he says, so he was kind of crestfallen, until they came to the point where there was a discussion in a certain halacha, and Rabbi Akiva said, that's halacha, that Torah is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, at which point in his Niskar Da'asoi, he's he felt, how shall I say, what's the word for it? He felt much more at ease. He felt more at ease. Just 1 second. Let me just. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so he felt more at ease. So. Oh, I didn't actually share my screen with you. Okay, let me just share the screen so you know where I am. So Moshe Rabbeinu then asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu, why did you give the Torah through me? You should have given it to Rabbi Akiva, since he's so much more advanced than I am. You should have given the Torah through him. So he said, no, that's the way I wanted to do it. Kach ala b'machshova, and that's the way it arose in my thought. And then Moshe Rabbeinu asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu, okay, so this is Rabbi Akiva. Let's see what his reward is. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, turn around and you'll see his reward. And then Moshe Rabbeinu sees that Rabbi Akiva was put to death, and they're weighing out his flesh in the marketplace for sale. Whether this was literally to be taken literally or not, nevertheless, a very horrifying picture. And Moshe Rabbeinu is completely horrified. And he says, this is Torah and this is its reward. Zu Torah v'zu schara, and this is Torah, this is reward. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, Shtok kach ala b'machshava. Silence, this is the way it arose in my thought. So the implication seems to be that you won't be able to understand what's going on over here. This is only something that I can understand with my machshava, and you cannot understand it with your machshava. Therefore, be silent and don't complain and don't make any comments. Silence is what is required over here. In other words, that I have a reason for doing what I'm doing, but you can't know that reason. Now, interestingly enough, the Rebbe Rashab does not bring this, but just it's brought by the Megala Mukois. Megala Mukois, Nota Shapiro, a very great Kubal and Tzaddik and so on and so forth. And he explains that the idea of Kach ala b'machshava is not a rebuke to Moshe Rabbeinu saying, be quiet. This is the way I regard it, and it's in my thought, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore you have no understanding of what it is. He was giving Moshe Rabbeinu an answer, Kach ala b'machshava, this is how Rabbi Akiva arises to the level of machshava of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But derech klal, we makabel from the dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even Torah is divrei Torah, right? We get it from the dibur. We don't get it from the level of machshava. The way Rabbi Akiva rose to the madrega of machshava was through mesirus nefesh, through for Torah, mesirus nefesh for Yiddishkeit, and therefore shtok kach ala b'machshava means that Rabbi Akiva rose to the level of machshava. So he's giving Moshe Rabbeinu a sort of a satisfactory answer, and an answer that Moshe Rabbeinu would have been satisfied with. He would have understood that this is the way that Rabbi Akiva goes to much higher madrega. In any event, let's continue now with the Maimer, and not my droshes. Okay, so we will understand this whole concept of kach ala b'machshava, this whole concept of the tziur in the oir, by what it says, kach ala b'machshava, shtok kach ala b'machshava. Be silent is the way it arose in my thought. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe. The l'chayr mashma, she'ein lezeh tam klal. At first glance, he would say that there's no reason. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling him, there's no reason for what I'm doing. I'm doing it because I want to do it. Right? This is my ratzon, and there's no reason for it. At first glance, that's what he's telling him. But how could that be? Right? How could it be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would just tell him, I'm doing this sort of on a whim? That doesn't really make sense the way we understand Torah, the way we understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it just doesn't make any sense. So the Rebbe Rashab agrees with that he points out that it doesn't make sense to say it that way, and therefore he's going to explain it differently. We should not explain it that way, that chas v'chalila, to say that this was a situation of just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided that this is the way it was going to be and there's no reason for it. No, there is a reason. We're not saying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it in a way of akshus, in a way of stubbornness. I'm going to do it because I want to do it and I can do it, therefore I will do it. No. It must be that there's a hidden reason that seichel, human seichel, cannot understand. It transcends human intellect. True, according to Seichel, we'll never understand why Rabbi Akiva had to die in such a brutal way, why he was treated in that way. Ein Tan was a klal. We can't explain it according to any human logic. And to the extent that even Moshe Rabbeinu was Seichel could not understand it, and he asked about it. This is Torah and this is its reward. Moshe Rabbeinu asked, how could that be? But it's kach ala b'machshova, it's a madrega machshova that can't be understood by human beings. In other words, it's the oir of chokhmah, as it is l'mana mi chokhmah hagluya. above chokhmah that is revealed. Again, zeu inyan ha'or shel ha'chokhmah k'mo shehu l'ma'ala mikli ha'chokhmah. This is beyond the vessel of chokhmah. In other words, chokhmah that can be grasped in some kind of kli, which we do have a shaykhus to. That even though this reasoning of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for doing the things the way that he did, there is an inyan of chokhmah and tam in it, although we don't understand it. As far as our chokhmah and seichel is concerned, shu kli ha-chokhmah, nira ki'ilu hu ratzon bli tam. It appears to us to be, this is what I want, and there's no reason for it, and don't bother me. But that's not in fact the case. There is a reason for it, and perhaps the Megala Mukos' reason is the reason for this, to lift Rabbi Akiva up to the level of seichel. But in any event, what he wants to bring out of this is that there's more than one level of inyonim, right? There's chokhmah hagluya, then there's chokhmah nistora, and he'll soon refer to that as what does he call it again? All right, we'll get there. I forget what he calls it now. I'm sorry. Just not thinking straight. Okay. Ikain hu mufshat migeda kli ha-chokhmah. The chokhmah that we're talking about is mufshat. It's stripped away from the kli of chokhmah. In other words, from the limitations of the kli of chokhmah, and therefore, which is seichel. Hainu gamsha mahaor mislabish ba'kli. We're not even talking about the or that is clothed in the kli, because the or that is clothed in the kli is also limited by the kli. So, in other words, when we're talking about the chokhmah here, the kach ala b'machshova, that chokhmah kamus, that chokhmah that is hidden away with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and only he can understand it. We're not talking about the or of chokhmah. We're certainly not talking about the kli of chokhmah. We're not even talking about the or that's melubash in the kli of chokhmah. Ki or kashem is labish bekli, because or when it's in a kli, haru kamo kli, then it's like the kli lahavin lahasig masha kli yochol lahasig. What the kli can allows you to understand, that's what understanding the oil of the sphere of chokhmah would be all about. The etzem or, but the essence of chokhmah, the etzem or chokhmah, mufshat mizeh, is stripped away from any kind of kli and any kind of limitation, even in the or. Shugam ken chokhmah, even though hagam shugam ken chokhmah, even though it's still called chokhmah, but it's chokhmah on a much higher madrega of chokhmah. It's not chokhmah lefi our grasp of chokhmah, but it's chokhmah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'harezel derek kamo hasechel shebemoach l'gabe hasechel shebenefesh hamaskeles. Kodim islapshusa beguf. Therefore, you could say that it's the difference. It would be like the difference between the seichel as we have it in our moach, in the seichel as it is in the human mind, compared with the seichel of the neshama as it is before it came down to the guf. The haskola of the neshama is obviously on a much higher madrega. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that Perek 47, I believe, that the neshama itself doesn't require any tikkun. Since the neshama doesn't require any tikkun, its hasoga is in the emes la'amitoy. It's masik the emes la'amitoy. It's masik the real truth. Masha Einkein was melubash in the seichel, it's melubash lefi erech, what we can grasp, and that's actually different for everybody. Each person has their intellectual limitations and so on. Again, shehu seichel hasig mahus haruchnius mamish. So the seichel, the neshama, it can be masik, can grasp the essence of ruchnius, the mahus, the real, true being and quality of ruchnius. I don't want to say the essence because that's usually the word etzem. Etzem HaChochmah, he's not using that word. He's using mahus and metzius. Mahus is the nature of the thing, and the metzius is the existence of the thing. But there are klal we can understand with our seichel. We can understand the existence of the thing. We don't understand the mahus, the real, true, inner qualities of an inyan of haskola seichel ha'elyon. So hasoga elyon, as he calls it. But the neshama, before it comes into the guf, it can understand the mahus haruchnius mamish, shizeh inyan hasoga elyoina. That's the concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hasoga, the way it is l'mayla. וכמו הסוגס המלוכים שמשיגים מהוס הרוחניus. Like the Malachim are able to grasp the mahus haruchnius, the essence of ruchnius. Essence again is not really the right word, but the quality of ruchnius. Hainu mahus haruchni de biyah, but not the quality of ruchnius of atzilus, only the quality of ruchnius of bria tzira and asiya. But they are able to grasp the true quality thereof. Why? Because they're not limited by the limitations of human intellect. And like the Malachim's hasoga is like something, for example, that doesn't have a place in time and space. Doesn't have a place in time and space. Something abstract, an abstract concept that doesn't have any analog in time and space. Let's say a mathematical concept, for instance, that doesn't have an analog in time and space. In other words, it's something that's like, let's say, an axiom, like an axiom, an axiom of mathematics doesn't necessarily apply in any time or any space. It's something that always was and always will be, but it doesn't necessarily apply it's not defined by time and space. Let's put it that way. And how much more so, even more than the Malachim, the Hasogas and Neshomas Began Eden, the grasp, the Seichel of the Neshoma Began Eden is much greater than the grasp of an angel. Why? Because a Malach is in a lower madrega than a Neshoma. The Etzim Indian of a Neshoma is Olam Atzilus. The Indian of a Malach, but their claw is Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, but not Olam Atzilus. Yes, it's true that there are certain malachim in Olam Atzilus, but they're quite rare. Whereas the Ika Inyan of a Neshoma is Olam Atzilus. That's the home of the Neshoma, so to speak. Okay, so again, B'kol shekain hasogas haNeshomas Began Eden shemasigim mahus haruchnius. They grasp the true quality of ruchnius. Shezeh inyan limud the Gan Eden. That's what they're learning in Gan Eden. What they're learning in Gan Eden is not the halacha of seis and baheres, two kinds of tuma. They learn about what that inyan is in ruchnius. In other words, basically they're learning what Kabbalah tries to bring out of Kabbalah Hasidus, try to bring out of an inyan in terms of the inner quality of ruchnius over there. For instance, in Derech Mitzvah Secho, you'll see a lot of this. That's the limud that there is in Gan Eden. Okay. They're learning the ruchnius in Gan Eden. That neshomas are able to grasp the essence of the inyan, or the true being, the true inyan. One second, let me just see the chat box over here. For me, it sounds like Nefesh Maskelis refers to Sechel and Nefesh Elokis and not to Nefesh Bahamis. I don't think he's even talking about the Nefesh Sichlis over here. I think he's talking about the Sechel and Nefesh Elokis, yes. Because he mentions Nefesh Maskelis, you're right. Yeah, so we're talking about the Sechel, but the Sechel Nefesh Maskelis. So we're talking about really not saving Nefesh Maskelis that like it is in the Guf, which is the Sechel of which is in between Nefesh Bahamas and Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Maskelis. But we're talking about the Sechel of the Nefesh Elokis. Yes, that's what we're talking about over here. Correct. Yeah, that's an old topic. It's true. Yeah. Okay. So, because can I talk as an shomas began Eden, was sigma who's a ruchnish, they in an alim the Gan Eden behold in which is a ruchnish boy. Shana shomas must sigim mahusa davar, they grasp the real essence of the real inyan. As I can seichel shebemoyach, which is not true of the seichel in the moyach, as is mulubish in the guf. Ein masig mahusa ruchni klal, doesn't grasp ruchnius. It only grasps the outer dimensions of it, which is called the Metzius, not the Metzius and not the Mahus. The fact that it's there, but not what it is. Mahus from the word Mahu, what it really is. We can only grasp the Mahus of something, the real Mahu, what it really is, if it's a Davagashmi, but not the Mahus of Ruchni. Sheben neshama klal. Therefore, the seichel in our moichin is not like the seichel in the neshama at all. The shama soga hirak b'mhus haruchni. Because over there in the neshama, the grasp is in seichel ruchni, mahus ruchni, the spiritual character of the thing. Seichel shebemoyach, whereas in the seichel in the moyach, rak musa gashmi. We only grasp the gashmi. Ruchni who can metzias lavad, and of the ruchnias we can only grasp that there is ruchnias, but not exactly what the ruchnias is. Lokmo hamidos lagabe seichel, and this is not like the relationship of midos to seichel. That even though midas and seichel are two different aspects, are two different qualities, two different metziases, two different inyonim, nevertheless, they are more or less matched one to the other. They are more or less like one's just an extension of the other. In other words, there's the existence of midas and the existence of moichin. Shneim mahusim ruchanim. They're both mahus ruchni, and therefore they're quite close to each other. But the seichel in the nefesh, as is mulubash in the guf, and the seichel as it is in the neshama, it's not like one continuum. It's not one continuum. They're two different inyonim, completely. Aval seichel shebenefesh hamaskeles. Shemasig mahus haruchni, harizeh kamo l'mayla mi'aseichel mamish, legabe haseichel hagalui. The seichel of the nefesh elokis is on a much higher level than the seichel in the moyach, to the extent that they seem to be completely two different things. Okay. Umekol makom, nevertheless, haregam hu seichel. Even the seichel in the moyach is also called seichel. Who makor the seichel hagalui. I'm sorry, the seichel in nefesh elokis is also called seichel, and it's the makor of seichel hagalui, even though they're two ends of the continuum, two ends of the spectrum. And so too we can understand, just as we see that there's a difference between the seichel in the moyach and the seichel the way it is in the nefesh, so too we can understand there's a tremendous difference between seichel hagalui, or chochma ila'a, chochma of atzilus, legabe chochma stimo, legabe the way chochma is in keser. Chochma stimo, but they're calling chochma is chochma of keser. So chochma, the way it is gilui, the sefiros gluya, v'hachochma ma'ayin temotzei, that it's already somewhat of an inyan of a yesh, even though it's not yesh mamish, but it's an inyan of yesh, which is chochma gluya. Legabe chochma stima, obviously there's going to be a tremendous difference between them, just like there's a difference between chochma in the moyach and chochma in the nefesh. Two different things. Similarly, as the kelim legabai or, the kli of chochma legabai the or of chochma. Or of chochma shor sham moiches timo. That the or of chochma comes from chochma timo, moiches timo. What's moiches timo? Again, the moichin of keser, the moichin that they are in keser. Sometimes moichin timo is called the moichin of ak, sometimes called moichin timo. But when we bring in Chassidus, it's usually moichin stimo as the moichin of keser, and that's why it's called stimo. So, okay. So again, the kalim legabe the or, and this is what we were talking about before, and that there's a tremendous difference, the kalim of Ayin Aroch to the or. Masha Einkain, the or itself is the or itself, even though there's a tremendous gap between them, nevertheless, the or of Chochma as it's Chochma Stima, and the or of Chochma as Chochma Gluya, the or of Chochma Stima is its Shirish of the Chochma Hagluya, the Chochma in the Moichi. But the or of Chochma in Olam Atzilus, for example, it comes from Chochma Stima, and therefore there's epis hashaychus between them. Okay, and he's going to explain this more. The or of Chochma, the Yosha, Gamber Shorshu Bechinas Chochma, even though even in its Shorish, it's the Bechinas Chochma, Al Kain Ha'ora, Hanim Sheches Mimeno, Laha'ir Bekliya Chochma, the Ha'ora that's brought down even to the Kli of Chochma is nevertheless, Haru Bechinas Islapshus, Vis Achdus Bekliya Chochma, the or that's melumash, it's actually unified with the kli haseichel of the person down here below in a physical goof. It's melubash and meyuchad with the kli hachochma lios ke'erech mahus hakli, so that chochma is mahus hakli ad she'ena be'erech shosher makoiro, to the extent that it is regarded as not be'erech shosher, even though it's shosher makoiro, even though chochma hastuma is the shorish of chochma hagluya. Nevertheless, they seem to be two different things because of the vast gap between them. As he goes on to say, chochma vatzilus is not be'erech legabe chochma stimo, and that's not like the midos and the seichel, as he said before. There's an erech between them. And as we see with human intellect, we see that the seichel and the moyach is not in the same category at all as seichel as it is in the shoma. It completely transcends the seichel as it is in the moyach. Okay, so what we're saying is, therefore, that there's even though both of them are called chochma, there's chochma in the moyach and there's chochma in the neshama. They're both called chochma. Nevertheless, tremendous gap between them, to the extent that they are roch one to the other. And the reason for this is as follows: al kein haoros asher nimshach b'moyach nasa b'chinas seichel k'mahus hamoyach hagashmi litfos rak mahus hadavar gashmi, and so on and so forth. Okay, again, even though they are ba'ena roch one to the other, nevertheless, both of them are called seichel. This is chochma and that's chochma. This is seichel, that's seichel. This is seichel melubash in the moyach, and that's seichel as it is in chochma stimo. In the chochma of the neshama. They seem to be ba'in aroch to one another, but nevertheless, they're called seichel. Both of them are called seichel. Why? Because the seichel in the neshama is the shirish of the seichel in the nefesh. Now, why are we emphasizing, belaboring this point to such an extent? I believe the Indian is as follows. In several, particularly in one of the letters of the Rebbe Rashab, in Torah Sholem, the Rebbe Rashab has a famous letter where he talks about the Indian of his boinanus. And he talks about the derech in his boinanus is to mafshit the inyonim which we know from the qualities which define them, so we can get to the inyonim the way they are in their makor and their shoirish. But derech hafshota, stripping away, derech of what would be called, the derech of his boinus is a derech of stripping away the known qualities until you can get to the unknown or the even unknowable qualities, and that's the inyan of his boinus in Chassidus. The famous letter from the Rebbe Rashab, I think it's right in the beginning of Torah Sholem. I have it upstairs. I could tell anyone's interested. I could tell you exactly what page, but in any event, I think that's why we're belaboring this point over here, that Afal P, that Seichel Shebemoyach and Seichel Shebeneshama are vastly separated. They're ba'en one to the other. Nevertheless, the Seichel Shebemoyach, the shorish of it is the Seichel Shebeneshama, and therefore from the Seichel Shebemoyach we can arrive at the Seichel Neshama through the process of Hafshota. Okay, I think that's the reason that we're talking about this particular union. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Again, the reason for this is the seichel in the neshama is still called seichel. Al kan ha'orasa, the ha'or of the seichel, not the etzem of the seichel. The etzem of the seichel is not drawn down to the seichel in the moyach, the seichel in the moyachim. It's only ha'or of seichel. But al kan ha'orasa nimshach b'moyach nasa b'chinas seichel k'mahus ha'moyach ha'gashmi, and therefore the seichel in the moyach can become physical seichel. It's processes going on in the actual brain itself, right? It's a moyach gashmi, and therefore it has the limitations of a moyach gashmi. It has the limitations of seichel as melubash in the brain. Litfos rak muhus damagashmi, so that we can only grasp the true nature of a damagashmi. With davar ruchni, where is it? When it comes to the davar ruchni, we can only grasp the metzias. Tofias rak metzias levad churu, as we said on a number of occasions already. Okay, you can only understand that it is, but not what it is. And that's why the seichel, when it becomes melumash in the kli of moichin, it becomes like the kli of moichin. In other words, it gets all the limitations of the kli of moichin. And it's no longer be'erich to a shorish makor. It's only ha'ora, and it becomes melubash, and that is lapshus changes the nature of the hasoga to the extent that it can only grasp that something is, but not essentially what it is. Like the seichel and the neshama can grasp. And as we said before, regarding the hasoga of Shama and Hillel, that when it came to the seichel of Hillel or the seichel of Shammai, then it became chesed, in other words, lahakel, in the seichel of lahakel, latahir, lahatir, in the seichel of Hillel. Masha ein kain in the seichel of Shammai, it was the union of chayev, it was the union of latame, leesor, and so on, because they come from the side of Gvura. Okay, but in the seichel of Hillel and Shammai, it's either chesed Hillel or Gvura Shammai. Shenasa Islam hasfora b'chinas chesed or Gvura mamish. The reason for that is the reason that it could be like that is because even in the seichel of the Rav, you can have the inyan of Helam, and therefore you can have the inyan of Achlivu Duchtayu. Sometimes Hillel will paskin l'chumra, and sometimes Shammai will paskin l'kula. Doesn't happen often, but it can happen. Why? Because the Svara, as a receiver from the Rav, holds both in yonim, by which we're trying to show that even on a higher madrega of oyer, the way it was, or the seichel it was, by Shmaya and Avtalyoin, before it got to Hillel and Shammai and became Chesed and Gvura, the or as it was by, or the seichel as it was by Shmaya or by Avtalyoin, contained both possibilities, Chesed or Gvura, right? Or rather, Chesed and Gvura. Both possibilities were implicit in the or, the way it was by Shmaya and the way it was by Avtalyoin. And what he wants to say is that therefore we must say that in the highest madrega of oiros, you also have the tziur. You have some kind of tziur in the or. The tziur in the or is not necessarily a limitation in the or, as we would call it limitation per se, but it is the inyan that there's a certain quality to the light that it could go this way, could go that way, but there is episode limitation. It's not the or in sof mamish. It's not or poshut, it's or mitzuyar. That's what he wants to point out, and that's the whole purpose of this this concept drosha that we're getting to. V'chein hu b'chochmei lo l'gabe chochmei stimo. Similarly with chochmei lo l'gabe chochmei stimo, with chochmei lo in olam atzilus, it's much closer towards the inner of chesed or gvura than it would be in chochmei stimo. In chochmei stimo, chesed and gvura are completely behelim. That's Chochma in Keser, but when it comes out in Chochma Hagluya, Chochma Ilah, Chochma Vatzilus, then it's noted towards Chesed, because Chochma is on the side of Chesed. And like we see with the root and the beginning, the makor of Chochma, even though it's Chochma, in other words, just like we said, Chochma Vatzilus, the shorish of it is Chochma Stima'ah. That's the word I was looking for earlier, Chochma Stima'ah. And that Chochma in its shorish is bebechinas pshitus. It's mufshat from its tziur. Doesn't have that particular those kinds of limitations in a visible way. It's in the same way that the Chochma Gluya has. it's pshitus, because pshitus legabe hachokma hagluya, kmo shto kach ala b'machshava. Like HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, kach ala b'machshava. This is the way I understand it, and you're not going to be able to understand it because your intellect, even though it's the intellect of Moshe Rabbeinu, is nevertheless human intellect. It's the intellect of a nivra. It's not the intellect of the boire. She'ein lezeh makom klal b'chokhma gluya. That cannot be understood in chokhma gluya. Hagam sheb'chokhma stimo yesh al zeh tam. And even though there was a reason for what happened to Rabbi Akiva in chokhma stimo, in other words, the Kodesh Baruch Hu knew what he was doing. It wasn't just a whim, right? V'hu min teisha tam da b'chokhma stimo hu l'mal mi'atam l'gabe chokhma gluya. It completely transcends our ability to understand it in Chokhmah Gluya. And therefore, we can't understand it. Even Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't understand it, and therefore, shtok kach ala b'machshava. That's the way I wanted to be. That's the way it arose in my thought. And even though the Chokhmah, when it's meluvish in a kli, takes upon itself the qualities of the kli to a certain extent, it's mugdar with the gedorim of the kli, it has the limitations of the kli. Nevertheless, essentially, the or itself, the kli, is called blima. The or of any of the sefiros, particularly the or of Chokhmah, is called the or of blima. It's bli mahus of the kli. It doesn't have the same mahus of the kli. Yes, it has certain gedorim that are imposed upon it by the kli, but nevertheless, it's b'chinas blima legabe hakli. In other words, if you take something that's completely limited and you compare it with something that's relatively unlimited, so it's called blima. Why? The etzem mahus, the essence of the oil, the way it is in its makor, in its shorish, in its root up above, there it's taka b'chinas pshitus, but not when it comes into the kli. And it is as if it's l'mayla misaychel v'hasoga, l'gabi in hasoga shel hakli, compared with hasoga as it is in the moichin in the kelim. Rak al yedei hakli nikne bazam ba hasoga kazu, and it's only because of the kli that the hasoga, the way it is in the kli, acquires such a tziur, such a position, such dimensions or configurations, etc. Even though we said that even in a cherish, it's the aspect of seichel, were it not for the kli, it would be like it is in a cherish. The kli is what puts the restrictions on the or and makes this particular configuration of or. It's only through the kli that it comes out as this particular inyan of seichel, to the way the seichel is in the neshama before it's mulu b'shin, the moichin. And therefore the or essentially is b'chinas pshitus legabe akli. Somewhat like the Ramak said. In other words, we're taking what the Ramak said and we're bringing out a certain nakuda thereof, that there is a certain inyan of pshitus in the or. Why? Because the kli is not be'erech to the or, and therefore the or is, in a certain sense, be'bechinas pshitus legabe hakli, even though really it's affected by the kli. So it's not be'bechinas pshitus mamish like the Ramak said it. Shakli ain't be'erech or, because the kli is not be'erech or, and that's why it looks like kli ain't be'erech or, and that's why they really be'ein aroch one to the other. We'll move on the inyan ba'ein aroch the kli legabe or, and we can understand that this inyan of the ein aroch, the kli ba'ein aroch to the or, who harba yoser, is much more so me'ha'ein aroch the or is lavish b'kli legabe shoshim ha'koiroi. It's much more the relationship of the kli to the or is much more ba'ein aroch than the ein aroch of the or melumash in the kli legabe the shorish of the or in the neshama. Or the shorish of the or in Atzilus, its shorish in Keser of Atzilus, is much closer than the relationship of the or to the kli. Why? Because the kli is a davar zar. It comes from a different shorish altogether. Masha'enkein the or is, yes, it's an or metzumtzam until it's not at ba'ein aroch to its shorish, but it's not the same ein aroch as the or to the kli. So there's madregas in ein aroch. There's Ein Aroch Lecha Bo'elam Hazeh, and there's Ein Aroch in other madrigas. Okay. As he goes on to explain the Ba'or HaMislabesh, that the Or, as it comes to be Melubish in the Kli, Harimashu Begere Inyan Asogas a Kli, that can be grasped by the Kli, and Hazerak Mitzad is Slapshus Ba Kli, only because it's closed within the Kli. So it's good for Hurufi, Shekam B'Shorju, B'Kim Chochma. This is also because in its Shorish is the aspect of Chochma. Va'or Raka Or Mimenu. And the Or, as Melubish in the Kli, is a Ha'ora of the original Or, and therefore, it's still chokhmah, but it's ba'in aroch to its original thing, and that's why it can be melumash in the kli and can be affected by the kli. But nevertheless, that ein aroch is not the same as the ein aroch of the kli to the or itself. But as regards the hasoga itself, it's similar to, it can be relate to the way it is in its shorish. Let me give you an example of this. It's an example which I use very often, so you'll excuse me if you've heard it 100 times before. When you're trying to teach a kid, like how to, the basic arithmetic, 2 plus 2 equals 4. So what do? You take two objects, right? 2 apples plus 2 apples, and you show him 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 2 oranges plus 2 oranges equals 4, until the kid will understand that 2x plus 2x equals 4x, right? Doesn't matter what it is. So 2x plus 2x is true regardless of what the things are. There could be pens, there could be pencils, there could be apples, there could be oranges, there could be anything, right? Or it could be nothing. Now, that fact that 2 plus 2 oranges plus 2 oranges equals 4 oranges is directly related to 2x plus 2x equals 4x, even though these are oranges, and that's a completely abstract concept. Right? So we see that there's a connection between the way the thing is in its shirish, 2x plus 2x equals 4x, and the way it is melubash in physical objects. There is a connection. In other words, the same connection still applies. So there's more of a connection between these two concepts than there would be, let's say, between oranges and apples. 2x plus 2x equals 4x, or 2 oranges plus 2x, 4 oranges, is much closer than oranges are to apples, let's say. Okay, so that's what he's just been saying. I hope that's clear. Okay. But the concept of ein aroch, of the kli to the oir, the grasp of the kli is not the grasp of the oir. Right? The kli knows only metzius, and the or has epis an inyan of mahus. The or has an inyan mahus. Okay, again, inyan ein aroch da kli legabay or, the kli is incomparable to the or, because hu be'etzem inyan asoga ba'achokma da kli and hu mahus achokma shel or, because they're two different kinds of asoga, two different kinds of grasps, as we said before. This is the Indian of ohros. This is the Indian, this is the Indian of metzius. This is the Indian of mahus. While derech zeh hu b'chol ha'oros the sefiros, and the same is true of all the oros of all the sefiros, not just chokhmah, not just bina, but all the sefiros. K'mo chesed delagav the atik nikra or lagav chesed olam dazo. Chesed olam dazo. So we have different madrigas of chesed. As we see in different psukim, there's chesed olam, eternal chesed, or chesed forever. But in Chassidus, it's explained that this is chesed that is shaykh to olam. In other words, it's chesed that's shaykh to helam ve'ester. It's shaykh to midah and gvul. That's why it's called chesed olam, because it's shaykh to Zeir Anpin, and the 6 sides of Zeir Anpin, like the 6 sides of space, certain type of limitation. Masha Einkein Chesed within Atik Yomin. Chesed within Atik Yomin is bleak wool. Lagabe Chesed of Zeir Anpin. Completely they're not in the same, they're not living in the same world. Nevertheless, there's a kasha between them. As he explains, even though the Chesed of Zoh is called Chesed Olam, and it has its limitations. Nevertheless, you can still have Chesed in Zer Anpin going to the Kli, the Or of Chesed going to the Kli of Gvura. Why? Shehari be'atika kadisha in Atik itself, afal pi sheyesh gam chesed gvura, because even though in Atik itself you have this inyan of chesed and gvura, we have the chasodim avak. Actually, usually it's not called Atika kadisha. I would like to actually find out if maybe in the handwritten version of this, as written by the Rebbe Rashab, it doesn't actually say Atika kadisha; it just says Atik. Shari Atik, or Atik, because Atik Yoimin is Shaykh to Midois, Shaykh to Chesed and Gvura. Atik Kadisha is Shaykh to the Seichel of Atik with Chochmah and Bina. It's not really Shaykh to the end of Chesed and Gvura. But in any event, let's take it loosely, that he's talking about Atik in general over here, in a general sense. Shari Ba'am, Ba'atik Kadisha, Avo Pishi Yeh Sham Chesed and Gvura. Amru, they said, when it comes to Atik Kadisha, lay smaller Bahai Atika. Call Yamin. There's no left side in Atik. It's all Yamin, and this is talking about in Atik Yoimin. In fact, L'chein or Gvura imiyah shubchins Gvura, and therefore the light of Gvura, the oil of Gvura, even though it is an aspect of Gvura, it's Gvura, because it's called the oil of Gvura. Mikomakom it's Shoshim Gvura is the Atik. Since we're talking about the Gvuras of Atik Yoimin, not Atik Kadisha, Atik Yoimin, Yachal Yos B'Kli Chesed. Therefore, that or can come down into a Kli of Chesed. Why? Because the Gvura of Atik Yoimin is on such a high madrega that it's not mitzuyar in a limited way. It's not like defined that it can only be Gvura. It could be Gvura in the Kli of Chesed as well. And similarly, Chesed and Kli of Gvura. It can all be in Shama Behilal, as we said before, with the Inyan Shama and Hillel, Shesh Mekula Beshama, that sometimes Shama could be lenient, but Tzadzecha are Rav. And this comes about because they're receiving it directly from the Rav, and therefore it could be Mitzchalef. It could change from Chesed into Gvura, or from Gvura into Chesed. Shubachim Pshitus Lagabei. The way it is in the Seichel of the Rav, it's in the Bechim Pshitus. It's simple and undefined. And therefore the reasoning can change, and therefore the psak can change. And therefore when we say that the oil is in the various kalim are called blima, which means blimahus, these oils are, yes, they're called blima, it's true, but it doesn't mean that blima completely. It's only blima lagabe the kalim. In other words, it's a relative blima. Right, this is an Einsteinian blima, if you want to put it like that. It's relative. It's relative. It's blima lagabe the kalim, but it's not blima mamish. In other words, the ohros do have a tziur. So they blima lagabe the kalim, and they could, in fact, exchange the kalim. The oil of chesed can go into the kli of gvura. And the kalim are not themselves. The kli of gvura remains a kli of gvura. The kli of chesed remains a kli of chesed. It's only the or that can be mishtane. Why? Because the or in a shorish is a higher madrega, and therefore you can get the or of gvura and the kli of chesed. The or of chesed and the kli of gvura. Ukanal b'moshel d'shama v'hilel, as we said before. The shorish kalim nimshchu meharishimo. That the kalim, the shorish of the kalim is the rishimo. What's the rishimo? The rishimo is the koach hagvul from before the tzimtzum. The ois is the rishimo before the tzimtzum is the koach hagvul before the tzimtzum. Then there's the tzimtzum, and then the rishimo becomes revealed. Okay, so again, the kalim nimshchu meharishimo shu shorish hagvul, shorish koach hagvul. That's what the rishimo is. Masha Einkain, the ohros do not come from the rishimo, the ohros come from the kav. We'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But moichin stima, the atika, but moichin stima, in other words, the hidden madrega moichin of atik, nimshach kav, is drawn from the kav. In other words, the ohros come from the kav. The kalim come from the koach hagvul, but the ohros come from the kav. It's ha'ora, it's not the etzem or of Orin Zor Baruch Hu, that's for sure. But nevertheless, it's a ha'ora of the kav and not from the rishimo. And it's a much higher madrega than the kalim. Why? Because it's koach habligvul. The kav is ultimately an expression that comes from koach habligvul. Even though the kav itself is not bligvul, it's relatively bligvul. Nevertheless, each shirish is the or habligvul. Masha'in kaini kalim. Their shirish is the koach hagvul, the or hamugmal. And therefore the shorish or is much higher than the Mahusa Kalim, Nikra Islam Blima, to the extent that the oris can therefore be called oris Blima. Even calls there, and oris the sefiros mamish. Nevertheless, they call the oris of the sefiros. And these are in fact the sefiros agnuzos. Sefiros agnuzos are the sefiros in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. That's why they call the sefiros agnuzos. There are other explanations of sefiros agnuzos, but that's what we're going with over here. Okay, he's going to explain that later on, and we'll get to speak about that later on. Also, even in the ohros, you have sefiros. You have limitations in the ohr itself, in the ohr of the kav. And this is shaykh only in the kav that you have the inyan of sefiros in the ohros. Obviously, in the ohr itself before the tzimtzum itself, excuse me, you don't have the inyan of sefiros in those ohros before the tzimtzum. Okay, Kitzur, Yuvan Zelaman, Mimasha Amar Razal, Shtok Kach Alaba Machshava will understand this inyan from what the Gemara says, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu to be quiet. Kach alaba machshava. From what does that mean? Kach alaba machshava. It doesn't mean that there's no reason for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing. Chas v'sholom to say such a thing. Rather, there is a tam, but it's a tam kamus. In other words, it's still an inyan of tam, but it's kamus. It's hidden from us, and we can't possibly understand it. At least not now. Maybe last Lava will understand, but not now. Right, so we see there's different madregas in time. There's time which we can grasp, reasoning, and then there's time which only HaKadosh Baruch Hu can grasp at this point in time. Okay, so that's time kamus. It's called time kamus. It transcends chokhmah as we know it. Legabe ora chokhmah datzilus. It transcends even the ora chokhmah datzilus, which is a pretty high level. Like the seichel in the neshama before it becomes clothed in the body, transcends the intellect the way it is in the guf. Right? Seichel of the body of the human intellect in the flesh. Nevertheless, the seichel in the neshama is nevertheless seichel, and it's the makor of the revealed seichel. The makor itself is also chokhmah. When the or is in a kli, therefore it has the quality, the being of what chokhmah is all about. The chokhmah, it's shaykh to the chokhmah of the kli. In other words, the shaykh is between the order in kli and the kli when it's melubash in the kli. Even though the makor is still called chokhmah, nevertheless, like the way it is in the keli. The or in essence is blima, legabaya kalim, compared with the kalim. The kalim are b'chinas yesh, masha'inka, and the or is b'chinas blima, and therefore ba'en aroch. Da'en aroch da or, and como en aroch da kalim. The kalim are mamish ba'en aroch to the or, but the en aroch to the or, one madrega or to another is not mamish ba'en aroch. L'chein achlifu duchtayu, and therefore they can change their places, or a chesed kli agvura, etc. Im ken haragama oiris and b'chinas sefiros. So it turns out that the oiris also have this quality of sefiros. And they're called blima only in comparison with the kalim, but they're not titled that way legabe other oiris. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, any questions? Okay, don't seem to be any. All right. I can all right, I'll put this I'll put it up as soon as it's finished transforming or converting, and it'll be online. All right, Rabbi Sai and Griyatai, good night.